wealth, and it's surely not to keep taxing American people. You know, you taxing this, you taxing that. And prior to 1916, how did you take care of the streets? You know, and roads and railroads and everything else in the schools. So, you know, how do we generate wealth to make the country great to begin with?
Great observation. Now, we haven't always had an income tax, and it's not in the Constitution, and that's why they had to amend the Constitution to get it through. My book actually starts with the Stamp Act. Okay. It talks about the entire tax history of the United States, and really to trace, you know, how we got where we are. Now, how did we have things that government provides before that? Well, first of all, government was expected to provide a whole lot less. But the things that it did provide were provided primarily through local and state governments, and then the federal government took care of the things that only it could do well, and was empowered to do in the Constitution. And I've written in my book that, you know, back 150 years ago, whether any measure before Congress was constitutional was something that was debated in Congress, you know, for days, maybe even weeks. Nowadays, nobody even cares. I mean, you see Michelle Bachmann arguing with people about that, but you know, that's about it. It's almost like, oh, we don't care what the Constitution says. It's a completely different approach, and I think we are an impoverished country, not just economically but morally, right, because of it.
Right. I agree.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I got one.
No.
No, if you would just lay out the fascinating link you found, or the circumstantial evidence linking the marriage tax to the whack thereof, marriage.
Well, there are, I mean, any tax discourages whatever is taxed. Now, that includes behavior, and that's why we see government, you know, proposing things like taxes on sodas and candy and things like that. They do understand it. And a progressive tax code, a marriage penalty, where if two people who earn money get married, they become one tax unit, they start paying a higher tax rate. Well, just like it discourages people from eating sodas and candy, it discourages people from getting married. And I've got in my book a couple of quotes from people who have said, yeah, you know, our accountant has said our tax bill, you know, will be about $1,500 higher every year if we get married. So we just live together. I had one really sad letter from a lady who said that they were shocked when they saw how much their taxes went up when they got married, and they were actually selling off things to pay for it because they couldn't afford the taxes. And then there was this one couple who got divorced at the end of every year so that they could claim single status on their taxes, and then got married again the next year and used the money they spent to take a vacation. I mean, it's ridiculous, but that's the kind of behavior that our tax system encourages, because people who've enacted it and all its myriad provisions didn't think through what rational responses, or in some cases maybe not quite as rational responses, would be.
This last question.
Yeah.
That's why I'm not understanding so much the income tax, because you got a person that's going out there and they're making a deal, you know, for worker service, or in worker service for, you know, for on money or whatever. And capital gains, I understand that, you know, capital gains tax, I understand, but taxing a person on their labor, it's a problem somewhat for me, because people go out there and they work hard all their life, and then I see taxes everywhere on them. Taxes on their home, taxes on some of their cars, paying money, you know, to park in front of their own street. I'm just seeing the government really building wealth off its own people. It's like a slavery to me. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why the forefathers didn't mention that in the Constitution. I don't know why we're paying it. You know, it's a heated discussion, and I understand it's complicated, but that is the issue.
Well, when our Constitution was being debated, and there was a lot of debate over what's called direct taxes or indirect taxes. Now, there's not really a precise delineation between those two, but generally, a direct tax is a tax that's much closer to the person, the income tax. It's a tax on a person's labor, like you just said. And that idea, you know, 150 years ago, that idea was anathema. Well, indirect taxes were things like customs duties, and they were considered, they affected the person much less. You know, you could, if you really wanted to avoid it, you could avoid, you know, the item that was being taxed, whereas you can't avoid earning money. And so, I mean, there was debate about this for days and days in the Constitutional Convention about direct taxes and indirect taxes, and that's why indirect taxes, or excuse me, direct taxes were specifically prohibited in the Constitution, and why they had to amend the Constitution to allow for it. Thanks for the question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I attended a panel at the Center for American Congress. They were talking about that we have a revenue crisis.
No, we have a spending crisis. I mean, I have in my book examples of all the waste and the fraud that we're paying for. Some of the just ridiculous things that we're paying for. You know, during the Depression, the government decided that it would fund these make-work jobs. Do you know that tax money actually went to a job to pay someone to shoot pigeons from public buildings? Well, and we see what's happened in this healthcare debate, where the people proposing this reform are saying, well, you know, we can pay for some of this by cutting out the waste, fraud, and abuse that's in Medicare. Like, no, wait a second. You know, if I ever, you know, when I was working at Accuracy in Academia, and you know, Reader Irvine was still alive, and he was my boss. And I'd gone to him and I said, hey, I've got this new idea for a project. And he said, okay, that sounds like an interesting project. How are you going to pay for it? Oh, well, I'm going to stop, you know, falsifying my expense reports. I'm going to, you know, stop having the people who clean our office come and clean my house and bill the company for it. You know, I'm going to just cut out, Dave was working with me at the time. I'm going to make sure that Dave isn't falsifying things anymore either. And then we're going to save the money to pay for this. Now, do you think he'd say, oh, okay, that's a great idea, go ahead with the project? Or do you think he'd say, you're out of here? Well, we need to tell Congress, if you know that you are overseeing this massive billions of waste, fraud, and abuse, it's time to say, you're out of here. Yeah?
When was there sort of a paradigm shift toward, you know, toward the idea that government should use taxes to sort of direct people through whatever doors it wants?
I go through a lot of that in my book, and I think it really started intellectually in the progressive movement, when you had a lot of people starting to think, you know, government should do more than protect rights. It should sort of be the sponsor of this society, you know, make sure that everybody gets their fair share and blah, blah, blah. But it never really went that far. You know, they did elect some representatives. They were successful in getting people at local levels elected, but it never really took off until the Great Depression. And, you know, there's nothing like panic to make people forget their principles and start just saying, you know, I've got to be taken care of, my family's got to be taken care of. I've got a quote from a congressman from Oklahoma in the book who talks about how government's just starting to pass everything around, you know, cutting up a pie. And he says, I don't believe in this pie business, but if we're going to cut up the pie, I'm going to make sure Oklahoma's going to get its piece of the pie. So it's that shift where you first see it intellectually in the realm of ideas, and then when people are scared, they're hungry, but they're scared that they will someday be hungry, then those ideas have been floating around out there, then they start to become more and more attractive. Then you have people who may have principled objections, but they're weak, they're getting pressure from home, whatever, they go ahead, they cave, basically. And then it becomes the expectation. Now, we all talk about, if government tries to provide health care, it's just going to make the premiums go up, everything's going to get worse. It's going to be, like England, where, you have to wait 6 months to see a doctor. Canadians who are coming here now are not going to have anywhere to go. We're going to be the new Canada. But really, there isn't a lot of discussion about, hey, this isn't in the Constitution. This isn't something that the government should do. Or here's an idea. How about changing all the laws that are making health insurance so expensive? How about getting rid of the ridiculous restriction that you can't buy a policy from an insurer in another state? How about rolling back the government and all the things it's doing to increase costs, instead of saying, oh my goodness, government's created this big problem. Well, I guess government has to solve it. No, you guys have done enough damage. Why don't you just get off our backs and we'll take care of it.
Okay, I have a question kind of about, it's largely historical based, but I noticed throughout when you're speaking, you use a lot of rhetoric from the Catholic authors. I guess one thing I've noticed throughout history is that the American society has had a very distinct shift from an agrarian society of, 1700s, early 1800s, to after Henry Clay introduced the American system to a highly industrialized one. At least from my observations, I've kind of noted that attacks you can't use the same economic principles in a largely agrarian society like that, like what the government managers did. You can't just simply apply the same policy that founders did to our economy today. It's gone from, agrarian to industrial to post-industrial. And I'm just kind of wondering how effective the rhetoric should be in an economy, in an economic system that's radically different from what it was 200 years ago. I just kind of want to know your thoughts about it, not necessarily consult.
Well, certainly we've had a shift in the kinds of industries over the years. But the basic way that wealth is created hasn't really changed. Wealth is created through work and through exchange. I take something, I make it better, somebody else has something that they took and made better or created, and I trade with them, and then we each have more wealth because we've done what we were good at, and we've traded with one another so that we each have more than we did before. Now you do that throughout a very complex society like ours, and you have wealth creation going on all the time. It's basically what Adam Smith called the invisible hand. Now, the example that I gave in the speech was deliberately simple, just to get us all talking about the same principles. It seems to me that if a government isn't necessary and isn't really any good at managing a very small society of just a few families, it's going to be even less good at managing a very complex society. Our economy, it's based on growth that comes from trade and work. And when government tries to intervene in those things, either through tax policy, through regulation, through spending policy, whatever, it increases the costs of creating wealth. It increases the cost of your labor, of everything that you use, and it actually dampens prosperity. And that's just a basic fact of how the world works, how wealth is created, and I don't think it's changed in the last 2,000 years, let alone the last 200.
Well, then, how do you regard the American system taught by Henry Clay? That was a taxing system on imports to generate a more robust American industrial sector. What do you think the impacts of that were?
I haven't really gotten into a lot of that time period in the book. There were actually even, around the same time as Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, a lot of them were starting to think, oh, government needs to do a lot more to sponsor economic growth. Most people didn't agree with that until, as I said, we got into a little later into the progressive era. Now, there are some ways that government can create wealth. For instance, national defense. It has to contract with Boeing to get fighter jets. Yes, that actually does create wealth. But that's a consequence of its fulfilling its proper function to protect the country, rather than some kind of economic scheme where it's decided, hey, we're going to somehow create wealth by taking from somebody and giving to somebody else.
All right, I was just curious.
Yes.
If you had to pick one tax policy, current federal tax policy to put in a chopping block, which would you choose?
Oh man, I don't know if I can pick just one. I mean, part of the problem is that they all kind of feed on each other. I mean, you've got the income tax, and you've got to pay capital gains tax, you've got to pay payroll tax, you've got to pay tax on everything you buy, you've got to pay tax on everything you sell. Then when you die, your heirs have to pay the estate tax. So, and they all work together to diminish wealth. So to pull one out, I mean, certainly we would say the progressive income tax is extremely harmful economically. The estate tax is arguably even worse. So I wouldn't even want to try to pick one. Yeah.
My father's a lawyer, and I've heard him for years complain about the idea of getting rid of the estate tax because, as he puts it encourages people to hoard their money. What is your response to that?
I'm not. How does he think that it does that?
He's an estates lawyer.
No, I'm not questioning it. I'm just wondering.
I think it's the idea that once people have so much money, the idea that they have more than they need or whatever, and he likes the idea of it, some of that going away, and instead of going to the heirs, who I guess he thinks that they'll just sit around and spend it or something. That it supposedly gets taken by the government and goes back into the system. I don't know. Whenever he starts complaining,
okay.
I usually kind of zone out. But,
he's saying because people know that their heirs are going to be taxed so much, they're actually hoarding more money to make sure they have more to pass on rather than give it charitably. Is that?
It's more along the lines of, if you don't face an estate tax, why would you spend the money during your life instead of leaving an endowment to your kids through your wealth? Like, why would you do philanthropy if you could actually leave it to your descendants and have them have a wealth centrally?
Okay. It seems to me that the estate tax actually discourages you from leaving it to your children because they have to pay so much in taxes. But besides that, I think the point really is it's your money. And if you want to leave it to your children, you ought to be able to. If you want to give it to charity, you ought to be able to do that. Now, we know from economic analysis that when prosperity is high, charitable giving is much higher, which makes perfect sense. If you have more money, you will be more generous with your money. So when government has these policies like the estate tax, the income tax that dampen prosperity, all in the name of, paying your fair share and giving a helping hand and so on, it's actually diminishing the freedom, the economic freedom and the moral freedom that people have to be more charitable at home. Yeah.
I guess what's just amazing to me is hearing all these taxes, and yet you look at our national deficit, it's 1 point whatever trillion. They obviously have enough money to draw from, yet they still can't manage a budget. Obviously, and that's what's in response to our changing economy and everything too. It's amazing that during the Reagan years, he cut taxes from 70% to 28%, yet revenue to the government was at an all-time high. So that whole idea that you have to have taxes, so high to develop revenue is false. I mean, and look at today. Our taxes are out the window, but our revenue to the government's down. So obviously, the government does not create wealth, as we've all seen.
And when Reagan cut it from 70, the only reason it was 70 was that John Kennedy had cut it from 91 to 70%. I mean, our income tax was once a marginal rate of 91%. It was actually even briefly 100%, but Roosevelt did that by executive order, and Congress undid it shortly thereafter. And yes, when Kennedy cut the top rate as he said, a rising tide lifts all boats. It did. Economic prosperity soared. It happened throughout history. Taxes get cut. There's greater prosperity. There's more revenue going into the federal government. Taxes go up. Prosperity goes down. Less revenue goes into the federal government. Now, you'd think they would say, oh, we're getting less revenue every time we raise taxes, and we're getting more revenue every time we cut taxes, so if we want more revenue, we should cut taxes. But instead they say, oh my goodness, revenue's going down. I guess we can't afford these Bush tax cuts. We better let those expire. We can't afford tax cuts. That's nonsense. We can't afford not to cut taxes.
Are we going to elect people to Congress because they're bright?
Unfortunately, one of the problems with democracy is that what gets you elected is being a candidate, which isn't necessarily what makes you a good congressman.
Just a quick question. It's all about wealth. It's all taxes. To really create wealth in our country, how difficult is it for an American to go abroad, start up a company, where the dollar is strong in the area, for instance, like Africa, maybe $8 to whatever. I think Americans are so close into just here. But I'm thinking, like, if you go over to another country where I live, like Europe, where you got sterling pound 2 to the dollar, I think it'll be beneficial to us to encourage entrepreneurship and to go deal outside the country to bring wealth in and to generate jobs as well. So you can target another market altogether and bring wealth like you used to prior to 1916, before all the taxes and everything else. That's just what it is. It's getting more money from other places and not just here. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I'm not really an expert on the policies of other countries and what you have to do to set up a business there and so on. I do think, however, that it's something where if you've already got a lot of money, it's obviously going to be a lot easier to do, and that's why we see so many of these companies setting up plants and setting up other offices in other countries, because they put them where the tax and regulatory policies are much more favorable. Then, of course, everybody starts complaining, oh, you're stealing jobs from Americans. Well, if you're so concerned about that, cut all the disincentives that are encouraging these companies to go elsewhere, and then they'll come back. Yeah.
As you probably know, the estate tax is actually set to go to 0 for 1 year moratorium on January 1st.
Yeah.
What if Congress does not pass a bill to keep it higher or from going to 0? What do you feel the reaction will be in the American public, say, a year without the death tax?
Well, I've written about that in my book, and I think it's a frightening thing. I mean, 1 year we have no death tax, and then we have the death tax again if the Bush tax cuts, of which that was one, are not extended, and it's not looking like they will. I mean, what it does to the expenses of estate planning is just horrific, because, as you probably know, you can't plan when you're going to die, so, or at least you shouldn't. And so, people don't know, what tax rate they're going to be subject to, at the time that they inherit. Now, I was talking to somebody saying, there are going to be some suicides in December if people, if this doesn't get changed. Maybe. I'm not going to predict that. I hope it's not true. But the bottom line is that, it's what Madison was talking about. When the law changes this way and that, so often that you can't even know what the law is going to be, or you can't know how to prepare for it in the event of a very natural but very unpredictable event like death. It just introduces a ridiculous level of uncertainty that's totally unnecessary.
You've talked some about the market distortions that are created by stuff like the soda tax, the marriage tax, things like that. Is there any system of taxation that you think minimizes sort of the market distortions and the moral hazards that are created by that?
Well, we do need to have taxes, unfortunately, because we need to have government, unfortunately. Historically, taxes that, as I talked about earlier, would be classified as indirect tend to have fewer negative impacts. A tax on income, a tax on labor, discourages what it's taxed. So, we see cases where, people think about starting another business, but they just decide not to because the marginal tax increase is not worth it. And what happens there? Well, they don't create all the jobs that would be in that business. I have a quote in my book from Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the Little House books. And she said, every time I wrote something, my taxes went up, so I stopped. Ronald Reagan wrote in his autobiography that he used to stop making movies around the middle of the year because his taxes just went up so much it wasn't worth it. So really the income tax is a very damaging tax. And we talk about, it's a class warfare argument, which is problematic on its face, that it only hits the rich. But in addition to being a morally questionable argument, it's also a false one. It doesn't just hurt the rich. It hurts all the people in the jobs that they would create, but don't. Now, on the other hand, consumption taxes, like we've talked about, sodas and beer and those kinds of taxes, those tend to discourage the thing that's being taxed. As a matter of deliberate policy, I think that's the government meddling where it shouldn't meddle. But in terms of what's good for the economy, it's simply better. If you have to discourage something, it is better to discourage spending than to discourage saving, working, and investing. Does that answer your question? Yeah.